Welcome to part 5 of the Zenith walkthrough. We are on mission 5, the Lost Home of Iskatel, and this is sort of a very iconic map, I think, for a few reasons. Firstly, whereas the exterior constructs of mission 2, particularly the ziggurat, were grandiose and aesthetic, they were sort of out of place. Again, this is somewhat due to limited time, but the maps had to be made so quickly that a lot of potential was basically thrown out. If you recall, the ziggurat was this massive construct that was surrounded by an empty cave alongside an interesting set of buildings, and there was a lot that could have been done to make it a lot more interesting. Now compare these two constructs, the Tower of Iskatel and the ziggurat. The Tower of Iskatel, I think, is a lot more preferable in terms of design because of its environment. There was an opportunity to wow the player with an amazing skybox, or maybe an underground city, or something brighter and less overly simple as a cave, or just something that basically gave some detail to the surroundings, to the background of the scene. Instead, there was just an empty cave. And whereas the surroundings of the tower were not very detailed, they were still very atmospheric, and the ocean skybox sort of blended in a lot more than most other Unreal maps with the same kind of scene. Another thing to note is that right when the player begins the map, they're impacted with the whole area of the atmosphere of the map, the ocean, the tower. The whole scene is presented to them. So this whole idea of conceptual groundness is presented in one blow to the fullest extent in the context of the map. The player enters the map and bang, the first thing they see is the tower, making it a very iconic scene. This in itself adds memory to the map. Not to mention that the previous few maps had been following an old pattern of Unreal architecture and scenery, whether it was the old castle scene or the Scar scene or the Sky City scenes, that is, the architecture and the texture combinations. This map brings something rarely seen, as its visuals come almost exclusively from the crypt scene, which is rarely used not only in single-player campaigns, but pretty much throughout the entire UT vanilla map set. And even custom maps, they don't really tend to use that texture pack and try to take advantage of those textures to make some unique architecture. And then there's the music, a piece called Dream of Napali by Alexander Brandon, which sort of underscores the feeling as you approach the tower of a sort of feeling of grandeur. All this begins to set the map up for something big. Unfortunately, as you enter the map, it's a little different. Notice the crapness and small scale of the lower levels. It would have surely been more impacting to present the player with something big. Fortunately, while the feeling of that conceptual grandness is lost at the lower levels, it does compensate for it as you climb higher up the tower, being able to look at the ocean from below so far above, and having some interesting rooms much larger and much more palatable than the dark and simplistic rooms below. So it should have perhaps been something wherein There was an introduction in the interior to perpetuate that conceptual grandness, but unfortunately that wasn't the route that was taken. In terms of the interior atmosphere, everything is consistent though. While it may not be as grand, it does give a feeling of creepiness and grimness, which is precisely the intent of the lower level. As you climb higher, the mood starts to change, and the color palette of the map remains a set of warm and cold colors that seem to keep a dark mood about them, but the feeling is one of more excitement than the lower levels. And the darkness begins to fade away into light as you get to the higher levels, which are more well lit. So it sort of blends in this the sounds, the music, and the lighting scheme as you climb higher. One thing that was particularly interesting in the upper levels is the use of sky textures that were set up as paintings overseeing larger rooms of the tower, like the library and the astronomy room. The feeling is perpetuated throughout most of the rest of the map, and the music changes in parallel to that. As we were discussing, you can notice that as the map changes in terms of lighting, or in terms of the sounds, or in terms of maybe just the mood overall, due to that, the music begins to change as well. The architecture dances between complexity and simplicity, but unfortunately more often than not it fails to impress, as many of the rooms end up being simplistic, although the lighting does a lot to keep them interesting. The flux is rather inconsistent because it's very easy to get stuck in the lower levels of the map, but it's very easy to find your way throughout the upper levels. This inconsistent pattern is not preferable, but the upper levels compensate for the slowness and unintended mystery of the lower levels. And that leads to the combat. So here there is a new enemy, the Nally Sorcerer, which is a very unique characteristic of the level and the mod for that matter. No other campaign had this kind of enemy except for some similarities in Nally Chronicles, as I recall. Now, there was the fighting Nally in Operation Apolly, but that Nally was basically a bot or a pawn that reflected the behavior of a bot. So they had weapons. In other words, there was a unique style of combat along with the new monster. And additionally, there is included another potential ally in a sort of side quest to close down the portal below. Once more, this map fails to take advantage of the potential you have with allies by restricting the space of the map. And as we were talking about before, this sort of adds on to the issues that the map presents due to its crampedness. And unfortunately, the Scar ends up being somewhat of a bother as you make sure he follows you throughout the upper levels. The other benefit, however, to closing the portal is that the enemies are reduced in the upper levels. And the friendly Scar is a more sophisticated ally because of the combat system he had that was implemented, but most players never had the chance to see it due to lack of unique events presented throughout the map that could have provoked that. Essentially, that combat system is provoked through long-term combat that really never happens because the player has hard-hitting weapons like the flak cannon that end up ending most combat situations quite promptly. And again, the crampedness also added to this because it was very easy to use these kinds of weapons with large collateral to eliminate enemies. You didn't really have to travel, and the Scar ally didn't really have to do anything for the most part because of that. Now, the storyline is also interesting in that this sort of place that we're in is a sort of strange venue for the character to take as the main character, rather, as the main character looks for something that might get him back into his timeline. but the subplot becomes the center of attention throughout the map as there are loads of details explaining what occurred. And this is sort of deviation from practice from most Unreal storylines, because there's no such thing in traditional Unreal, at least, as Scar monks or Scar that work independently of their queen. So overall, the exterior of the map is iconic, and it remains one of the most memorable maps throughout the campaign, largely due to its presence as a bold figure of exterior mapping, and also because of its presentation. The combat reflects a build-up of intensity, and the lighting, textures, and architecture work very well to present a specific and intended atmosphere. So this was a great improvement from the inconsistencies shown in Mission 4, the Azure Crag, where basically you had a sort of old conventional approach to mapping. It was the old style of Unreal that nobody really ever wanted to see in the first place because they've seen it 1,000 times before. It might not be quite clear what you have to do at the beginning. Also pay attention to, if you want to know exactly what's going on, what exactly you have to do, both to complete the side quest and also to actually get access to the upper levels. Well, you basically have to have the key that is in the room on the opposite side of the hallway where you go up one level. After that, you basically can access the upper levels. And also there's an artifact once you get to the upper levels and open the gate. There's an artifact you can get that's worth a lot if you trade it in at the hub during the intermission. Another interesting part of Zenith in general was the use of music that wasn't really in the frame and the atmosphere of Unreal Tournament every so often, or Unreal for that matter, but also that it still agreed with the atmosphere, and actually the atmosphere and the music almost everywhere in Zenith really blends together, which was an interesting approach to using music to sort of saturate the atmosphere. Also, it was really interesting to have Alexander Brandon and Mikkel van den Bos, their tracks, their works on a lot of the parts of Zenith, and it was interesting how still yet, even with that kind of music, which, because they were both authors of music from Unreal, still it was easy to have the levels agree with the tone of the music. But even at that point, it was interesting to see that the atmosphere and the music blended together, and that's one other thing that some players made note of when reacting to playing Zenith. Now, one of the interesting parts, as we're about to get to the boss fight in a little bit, but one of the interesting parts of Zenith was its overall, in the entirety of the campaign, it's actually a very challenging campaign. It's perhaps not necessarily so long that it's challenging in the same way that Operation Apollo is challenging in terms of just completing the vastly large campaign. It's difficult due to combat intensity, largely. And yes, there are some cases where the flux is sort of jagged, so it's not as flowing, but it's not so much as impacting as it could have been had it been even less helpful. You know, you still have hints and you still have objectives and everything like that. So the main factor is the combat system and the combat intensity. So it's sort of a real feat in gaming for Unreal Tournament to complete Zenith with all boss fights on heroic mode. In comparison to any sensible campaign, I think Zenith is actually one of the hardest ones to complete because of this, because it presents you with all kinds of different combat situations that other campaigns never really considered implementing, and to implement them to a certain degree of difficulty, even if it had normal and hard difficulties for the campaign itself. For example, in Operation Apollo, even on hard difficulty, it wasn't necessarily difficult to get through the mod, because you had so many opportunities to do certain dodge tactics and evasion tactics, like shooting around corners, and basically the whole set of tactics that you use for fighting Unreal Tournament bots. The levels, most of them are large enough. The same thing with 7 Bullets or Zydia Gold. They're large enough that you can basically maneuver throughout the map, doing things such as kiting and other tactics to eliminate your enemies. In Zenith, it becomes a lot more difficult to do that because you're given a lot of combat situations where that is impossible. This is largely found in the boss fights, but it's also found throughout the entire level. Well, rather through the entire set of levels. So now on to the boss fight. This boss is probably the second hardest boss in the entire campaign. And what you do on normal mode is damage him down to 0, and then he transports you to some basically sort of black zone where you have to kill him again. And as I recall, there should be no enemies on normal mode, no ads at least. So when you're transported to the black zone, you have to kill him once more. All you have to do is simply keep moving, either to the left or to the right, and stay moving as you attack the boss and make sure you avoid his shots. But if it's on heroic mode, a few things will happen. Firstly, there's going to be a few ads that will spawn in the beginning, which will spawn more ads if, well, as they, go along fighting you, meaning that you have to kill the boss as fast as possible, and you have to be really dodgy because as the fight continues, the ads are going to spawn more ads. So the same thing happens once you damage him down to 0. He's going to transport you to the empty zone in heroic mode. What you have to do is focus on the boss through the entire fight. Ignore the ads. And firstly, white flares are going to spawn basically everywhere along the platform in the black zone. And you have to avoid these as much as possible because they do heavy damage. You should probably fight the boss in between them if you can, or avoid them by walking on the corners of the platform along the wall. And also, a sorcerer will spawn every so often that you have to kill, so you really have to watch your health, because taking that for granted is going to get you down to critical health, and eventually you're going to make a mistake and get hit. Conserve your health as much as possible in the first part of the fight. Every so often, part of the platform is going to turn red, and basically, if you're in that region, your screen will turn red or yellow, and you have to get out as fast as possible, or you will immediately die after like 5 seconds. And all the while, you have to make sure you're attacking the boss and actually doing damage, because these things are going to cycle over and over. When the floating wall comes down, use the laser pistol's heat-seeking missiles to do some damage by firing them above the wall. And also make sure to pay attention to all these mechanics to survive, because if you, again, act lax in this fight, you're going to get killed a lot. It usually takes a few tries to do this, so you should be patient. Also, make note that Zenith has an anti-cheat system, so if you try to cheat during any boss fight in heroic mode, you can still cheat. It does allow you to still cheat, but it basically nullifies your progress in accessing the extras or the bonuses provided if you complete the campaign killing every boss in heroic mode.